in the quiet deserts of New Mexico, long before the world knew his name, J. Robert Oppenheimer stood as a man divided against himself. To history, he would become the scientific mind that helped save America during its darkest hour. But to himself, he would become something far more troubling, a man who had unlocked a force humanity was never meant to control. This story does not begin with explosions or victory parades. It begins with a soft-spoken physicist who believed knowledge could protect the world, only to discover that knowledge can also haunt the soul. When World War II erupted, America was not prepared for what lay ahead. Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe, and intelligence reports whispered a terrifying possibility that Adolf Hitler might be building a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. A weapon powered not by gunpowder, but by the atom itself. To the scientists who understood what that meant, it was not just another military threat. It was an existential one. If such a weapon fell into Nazi hands first, civilization itself could end under a dictatorship that showed no mercy. Oppenheimer knew this. He felt it deeply. He was not a soldier. He was not a politician. He was a thinker, fragile, brilliant, and deeply philosophical. He loved poetry, languages, and ancient texts as much as equations. But war has a way of pulling even the most reluctant minds into its machinery. And when America came calling, asking him to help lead a secret project to harness the atom, he did not see himself as a destroyer. He saw himself as a shield. At first, there was purpose, clear, urgent, and morally simple, at least on the surface. Beat Germany, end the war, save lives. Oppenheimer believed that if the bomb could shorten the conflict, fewer soldiers would die on the battlefield. Fewer cities would burn. Fewer mothers would receive letters that began with, "We regret to inform you." This belief sustained him through exhaustion, secrecy, and unbearable pressure. Los Alamos was built in isolation, hidden from the world, and cut off from normal life. Families lived under assumed identities. Letters were censored. Conversations were guarded. And at the center of it all stood Oppenheimer, leading some of the greatest scientific minds in history. He pushed them hard, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear that they were racing against time. Fear that somewhere in Germany another scientist might be closer than they were. Yet even in those early days, guilt began to take root. It came quietly, in the silence after long nights of calculations, in moments when he stared at the desert horizon and wondered what would happen once the knowledge they were creating could no longer be contained, because Oppenheimer understood something many others did not. Once this weapon existed, it could never be undone. The world would never return to innocence. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, a quiet question spread through Los Alamos like a whisper. Should we stop? The original reason for the bomb was gone. Hitler was dead. The Nazi threat had ended. But the project did not stop. Instead, it accelerated. Japan was still fighting, and America, exhausted by years of war, wanted final victory. Oppenheimer felt the weight of that decision more than most. He did not control policy, but he controlled possibility. And possibility, once open, demands consequence. Some scientists urged restraint. Some suggested a demonstration instead of a city. Oppenheimer listened, But he also understood the reality of wartime leadership. The momentum had become unstoppable. The bomb was no longer a theoretical idea. It was a finished sentence waiting to be spoken. On July 16, 1945, when the first atomic bomb exploded in the New Mexico desert, Oppenheimer watched silently. The light was brighter than the sun. The shock wave rolled across the earth. And in that moment, history changed forever. The world had entered the nuclear age. Oppenheimer did not cheer. Instead, a line from ancient scripture surfaced in his mind, words he had read long before he ever imagined leading a weapons program. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He would later quote it publicly, but in that moment it was not a performance. It was a confession. What haunted him was not pride. It was realization. He had done what America asked. He had helped save his country. But in doing so, he had helped create a future where humanity lived under the shadow of instant annihilation. And once that truth settled in his heart, the guilt never left. This was only the beginning, because the war would end, but Oppenheimer's punishment, isolation, and inner torment were just beginning. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world saw an ending. But for Robert Oppenheimer, it felt like a beginning one he never wanted. On August 6, 1945, the news reached Los Alamos that the first bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. At first, there was silence. Then there were cheers. Applause echoed through the rooms, where men and women had worked in secrecy for years. Some cried with relief. Some hugged. To many, it meant the war would finally end. To many, it meant they could go home. Oppenheimer stood among them, but he did not celebrate the way others did. He smiled because he was expected to. He spoke because leadership demanded it. But inside, something had fractured. The calculations he had overseen, numbers on paper, equations on chalkboards, had transformed into firestorms. Shadows burned into concrete, and tens of thousands of lives erased in seconds. For the first time, the abstract had become painfully human. 3 days later, Nagasaki was destroyed. The second bomb was different. The first could be rationalized as necessity. The second felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the weapon he helped create was not just a deterrent, not just a warning, but a usable tool of policy. And that realization crushed him. Oppenheimer had believed the bomb would end war. Instead, he realized it had redefined it. As Japan surrendered, America celebrated victory. Newspapers praised the scientists. Politicians called the Manhattan Project a triumph of American ingenuity. Oppenheimer was hailed as a hero. His photograph appeared in magazines. He was invited to Washington. He was thanked personally by President Truman. But gratitude could not silence guilt. When Oppenheimer met President Truman, he spoke words that revealed the burden he carried. He told the president that he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman, focused on geopolitics and victory, reportedly brushed it aside. To him, the bomb was a military decision. To Oppenheimer, it was a moral wound that would never close. That meeting marked a turning point. Oppenheimer realized something deeply unsettling, that the people in power did not feel what he felt. Where he saw tragedy, they saw leverage. Where he saw suffering, they saw strategy. And slowly, painfully, he understood that the world he had helped create would not be guided by philosophers or poets, but by fear and competition. From that moment on, Oppenheimer began to speak differently. He no longer advocated for more powerful weapons. Instead, he urged restraint. He warned against an arms race. He argued that nuclear weapons should never become normal tools of diplomacy. He believed that the horror of Hiroshima should be enough to stop the world from going further. But the Cold War had already begun. The United States and the Soviet Union stood on opposite sides of a new conflict, one without trenches or front lines, but with the potential to end civilization itself. And in this new world, Oppenheimer's caution was no longer seen as wisdom. It was seen as weakness. His guilt made him dangerous, because guilt questioned progress. Guilt slowed momentum. Guilt introduced doubt where power demanded certainty. As America pushed forward, developing the hydrogen bomb far more destructive than anything used in Japan, Oppenheimer objected. He argued that such a weapon crossed a moral line, that it offered no true defense, only the promise of total annihilation, that building it would not make the world safer, only more fragile. Those objections did not go unnoticed. In a nation gripped by fear of communism, suspicion grew easily. Oppenheimer's past associations, his friendships, his political sympathies from the 1930s were dragged back into the light. Context was ignored. Nuisance was discarded. The man who had once been trusted with the fate of the Djibouti world was now quietly being rebranded as a liability. And Oppenheimer felt it. He felt doors closing, conversations changing tone, invitations slowing. He felt himself moving from the center of influence to its edges. His guilt, once private, was now public and deeply inconvenient. The irony was cruel. He had helped save America from its enemies, and now his conscience made him one. At night, he returned again and again to the same question: if the bomb ended the war, why does it feel like something far worse has begun? There was no answer, only the weight, and that weight would soon become punishment. By the early 1950s, Robert Oppenheimer was no longer the celebrated architect of victory. He was something far more dangerous in the eyes of power, man who remembered too much and who refused to forget. America had changed. The relief of victory had hardened into suspicion. Allies became rivals. Silence became loyalty. Questions became threats. The Cold War was no longer a distant concept. It had seeped into classrooms, offices, laboratories, and living rooms. Fear ruled the atmosphere, and fear demanded certainty. Oppenheimer did not offer certainty. He offered reflection. He spoke openly about the dangers of nuclear escalation. He warned that building ever more powerful weapons would not create safety, but permanent terror. He argued that scientists had a moral responsibility beyond obedience, that knowledge carried consequences that could not be ignored. In another era, those words might have been praised. In this one, they were remembered, recorded, and eventually weaponized against him. The hydrogen bomb debate sealed his fate. When the United States considered developing the hydrogen bomb, a weapon vastly more destructive than the atomic bombs used in Japan, Oppenheimer opposed it. Not quietly, not privately. He opposed it clearly, ethically, and on record. He believed the weapon had no defensive purpose, that it crossed a line humanity could never step back from. He warned that its creation would trigger an uncontrollable arms race. Others disagreed, some out of fear, some out of ambition, some because they believed power itself was safety. And those voices were louder. Behind closed doors, Oppenheimer's stance began to be reframed. His caution was labeled obstruction. His ethics were labeled hesitation. His guilt was labeled unreliability. And soon the question was no longer about weapons, but about him. In 1954, the U.S. government called him before a security hearing. It was not a criminal trial. There were no charges, no jury, no presumption of innocence. It was an administrative proceeding, held largely in secret, where the outcome felt decided before the first word was spoken. The accusation was simple and devastating, that Robert Oppenheimer could no longer be trusted with national secrets. Every corner of his life was examined. Old friendships from the 1930s were resurrected, friends who had flirted with left-wing politics. During the Great Depression, when such ideas were common among intellectuals, conversations long buried were pulled out of context. Charitable donations were recast as ideological allegiance. Even his honesty, his tendency to speak, openly rather than defensively, was turned against him. Witnesses testified. Some supported him. Others hesitated. A few, motivated by rivalry or fear, spoke in ways that damaged him. Personal conflicts were dressed as national security concerns. Philosophical disagreements were treated as evidence. Through it all, Oppenheimer did not lash out. He did not deny his doubts. He did not renounce his beliefs. He did not pretend he felt no guilt. And that may have been his greatest mistake. In a system built on fear, conscience looked like weakness. The hearing dragged on for weeks, emotionally exhausting and deeply humiliating. The man who had once coordinated the greatest scientific effort in history now sat alone, defending not his actions, but his thoughts, his motivations, his morality. At the end, the verdict arrived quietly. His security clearance was revoked. Just like that, Robert Oppenheimer was stripped of influence. He could no longer advise on nuclear policy. He could no longer shape the future, weapons he understood better than almost anyone alive. He was not imprisoned. He was not publicly disgraced in headlines. He was simply erased from power. The punishment was precise and devastating. It told every scientist watching, build what we ask, but do not question why. It told every thinker listening, your conscience is tolerated only when it aligns with authority. For Oppenheimer, the guilt that had begun with Hiroshima now had a second weight, the knowledge that his attempt to slow destruction had instead accelerated his own isolation. He had saved America. He had warned it, and for that he was silenced. In the years that followed, he withdrew from public life. He continued teaching. He continued thinking. But the center of history moved on without him. New weapons were built. Stockpiles grew. The world edged closer to the brink he had feared. And Oppenheimer lived with the unbearable irony that the man who unleashed the atomic age was punished not for creating the bomb but for fearing it. After the hearings ended and his security clearance was taken away, Robert Oppenheimer did not rage against the system that had broken him. He did not launch public attacks. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he did something far more painful. he became quiet. Not silent, but distant. The world he had once shaped now moved forward, without asking his opinion. Decisions about nuclear weapons, arms expansion, and global strategy were made in rooms he would never again enter. Younger scientists replaced him. Harder voices dominated the conversation. The hydrogen bomb was built. Stockpiles grew. The nightmare he had warned about unfolded step by step, and Oppenheimer watched it happen from the sidelines. He accepted a position as director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a place of ideas rather than influence. There he returned to teaching, reading, and reflection. Outwardly, he was respected. Inwardly, he was haunted. Every lecture, every discussion carried the shadow of what he had helped unleash. The guilt never left him. It matured. In private conversations, he spoke less about Hiroshima and more about responsibility. He believed the bomb had ended a war, but he could not escape the knowledge that it had also opened a door humanity might never close. The balance between saving lives and taking them tormented him not as an abstract problem, but as a personal burden. He often returned to one question: could I have stopped it? The honest answer was unclear. The war was brutal. The stakes were immense. The pressure was overwhelming. But guilt does not care about context. It does not negotiate with logic. It settles quietly and stays. Oppenheimer once said that scientists had known sin not metaphorically, but intimately. He meant that they had crossed a threshold where knowledge could no longer be separated from consequence. And unlike politicians or generals, scientists could not claim ignorance. They understood exactly what they had built. As the Cold War intensified, his warnings proved tragically accurate. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world within moments of nuclear catastrophe. Children practiced duck and cover drills. Entire cities lived under the assumption that tomorrow might never come. The bomb had not ended fear, it had institutionalized it. History began to look back. Scholars re-examined the security hearings. Declassified documents revealed how political rivalries, personal grudges, and Cold War paranoia had shaped the process. The narrative of Oppenheimer as a potential threat slowly collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was a man punished not for disloyalty, but for discomforting honesty. Years after his death, the U.S. government formally acknowledged that the treatment of Oppenheimer had been unjust. It was a symbolic act, long delayed. It did not restore his influence. It did not erase his suffering, but it mattered, because it admitted a truth nations rarely confess, that fear had overridden fairness. By then, Oppenheimer was gone. He died in 1967, not as a villain, not as a hero, but as something far more human. A man who helped save his country, and then spent the rest of his life questioning the cost of that salvation. His guilt was not weakness. It was awareness. He understood that progress without restraint becomes destruction, that victory without reflection breeds repetition, and that the most dangerous moment in human history is not when power is created, but when it is normalized. Today, Oppenheimer's story resonates more than ever. In a world driven by rapid technological advancement, artificial intelligence, and weapons of unimaginable scale, his life offers a warning written not in anger, but in regret. that those who build the future must be allowed to question it. That conscience is not disloyalty, and that guilt, when it arises from empathy, is not something to punish, but something to listen to. Robert Oppenheimer felt guilty for saving America not because he hated his country, but because he loved humanity enough to fear what came next. He did not regret ending a war. He regretted starting an age. And in that regret lies his true legacy, not the bomb, not the trial, not the silence, but the reminder that intelligence without morality is incomplete. History eventually understood him. The tragedy is that it took so long.